On December 16, 1811, at 2:15 in the morning, the stable center of North America began to rupture. The shaking started as distant thunder, then escalated into a roar that lasted between 1 and 3 minutes, an eternity when the ground beneath you is moving in waves. Log cabins disintegrated, trees whipped so violently their branches knotted together. The Mississippi River developed standing waves, pulsing up and down like water in a shaken container, capsizing boats despite windless air. This was the opening salvo of a 6-month barrage that would produce over 2,000 distinct earthquakes. The most powerful, a magnitude 7.7 to 8.1 event on February 7, 1812, violently shoved sections of the Mississippi's bed upward by as much as 15 feet, creating temporary waterfalls and forcing the river to run backward for several hours. 18 miles of Tennessee forest land dropped overnight, flooding instantly to create Reelfoot Lake. Geysers of liquefied sand shot to the tops of trees. Church bells rang in Boston over 1,000 miles away. The New Madrid earthquakes weren't supposed to happen. The American Midwest sits thousands of miles from any tectonic plate boundary, anchored to some of the oldest, most stable bedrock on the continent. Yet this region experienced seismic violence that fundamentally rewrote the geography of North America. And the geological evidence buried in mud layers proves this wasn't an anomaly. It's a cycle. We are taught that 98% of the world's earthquakes occur at the edges of tectonic plates. The San Andreas Fault, the Pacific Ring of Fire, the collision zones where India grinds into Asia. These are places where the Earth's violence is visible. Mountains thrust upward, coastlines shattered by subduction, landscapes actively deforming. The central United States is none of these things. It is a vast, flat expanse of agricultural land sitting in the middle of the North American plate. The nearest plate boundary lies over 1,000 miles away in either direction. The bedrock beneath Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Kentucky is Precambrian crystalline rock, ancient continental crust that has been geologically stable for over 1 billion years. By every conventional understanding of plate tectonics, this region should be seismically quiet. The new Madrid Seismic Zone is the largest violation of that rule in North America. Centered on the town of New Madrid, Missouri, this fault system is actively generating roughly 200 measurable earthquakes per year. Most are minor, magnitude 2.0 or less, imperceptible without instruments. But the system is unmistakably active, and the geological record shows it is capable of producing catastrophic events in a place where catastrophic events should not exist. The explanation lies 500 million years in the past. Around 500 to 600 million years ago, tectonic forces attempted to rip the North American continent apart along a line that runs roughly beneath the present-day Mississippi River Valley. The continent began to rift, the same process currently splitting Africa along the East African Rift. Magma pushed upward, the crust thinned and fractured. A new ocean basin began to form. Then the rifting stopped. The forces driving it weakened or shifted. North America remained whole, but the damage was done. The Reelfoot Rift, named after Reelfoot Lake, which wouldn't exist for another 500 million years, left a deep scar of weakened, fractured crust buried beneath what would eventually become stable continent. That ancient wound never fully healed. Today, the North American plate is under constant compression. The mid-Atlantic ridge is spreading, pushing the continent westward. The Pacific coast resists that motion with collision and subduction forces. The entire plate is being squeezed, and that stress doesn't simply disappear in the middle, it accumulates. It searches for weak points. The Reelfoot Rift is a weak point. Stress concentrates there, building slowly over centuries until the faulted rock can no longer hold. Then it fails catastrophically. At 2:15 a.m. on December 16, 1811, the fault ruptured. Frontier settlers along the Mississippi Valley were thrown from their beds as the ground began moving in waves. The shaking wasn't a brief jolt. It lasted between 1 and 3 minutes of sustained violence. Log cabins collapsed, chimneys exploded into bricks, trees bent so severely their crowns touched the ground, branches tangling with neighbors as the forest whipped back and forth in total darkness. The sound preceded the shaking by seconds. A deep rumble that witnesses described as distant thunder rolling closer, escalating into a roar that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. Then the ground stopped being solid, it undulated. People attempting to stand were thrown down repeatedly. The earth moved like the surface of a storm-tossed sea. On the Mississippi River, boatmen experienced something no one had recorded before. The water developed standing waves, stationary oscillations that pulsed vertically rather than flowing downstream. Boats capsized in windless conditions as the river's surface churned and heaved. Some crews reported the current reversing briefly, even during this first major shock, a preview of what was coming. This wasn't happening at a plate boundary. This was the ancient Reelfoot rift rupturing from accumulated stress. The shock waves radiated outward through cold, dense Precambrian bedrock that transmitted the energy with terrifying efficiency. Unlike California's hot, fractured crust that absorbs seismic energy quickly, the Midwest's ancient continental shield acted like an acoustic amplifier. The first major tremor was followed by a second massive shock at 8 a.m. the same morning. Then another significant quake struck on January 23rd, but the most powerful was yet to come. On February 7, 1812, at approximately 3:45 a.m., the fault released an earthquake recently estimated between magnitude 7.7 and 8.1, the most powerful in recorded American history. The ground surface ruptured. Near New Madrid, the Mississippi's bed deformed violently. Sections of riverbed upstream suddenly dropped several feet, while downstream sections thrust upward, creating scarps, instant cliff faces up to 15 feet high where flat land had been moments before. The Mississippi River stopped flowing forward. Then it reversed. The mechanism was brutal physics. The earthquake had created an instant dam by raising the downstream riverbed. Water doesn't flow uphill, but when you suddenly elevate the river bottom ahead of a moving current, the water upstream has nowhere to go. It stacks up. The column is disrupted. And when the pressure equalizes, water from the now higher downstream section rushes backward. For several hours, the Mississippi flowed in reverse as the river system attempted to stabilize across a fundamentally altered landscape. Riverboat crews watched the water pile against itself, rising and churning. Boats that had been floating suddenly grounded as the riverbed rose beneath them. Others were swept backward upstream. When the river finally resumed its normal course, it was flowing through geography that had been violently rewritten. In northwestern Tennessee, approximately 18 miles of forested land suddenly subsided. The ground dropped, water rushed in, Reelfoot Lake appeared, 13,000 acres of water drowning cypress forests that had stood for centuries. The dead trees remained upright, creating a flooded forest that still exists today, a permanent monument to the moment the Earth reshaped itself. This was accompanied by phenomena that seemed supernatural to witnesses. The intense shaking triggered soil liquefaction across hundreds of square miles. Subterranean groundwater mixed violently with deep sand layers. The pressure sought release. The ground cracked open and erupted with geysers, sand blows, that shot liquefied sand and water 15 to 20 feet into the air, as high as the surrounding treetops. These eruptions left behind sand dunes and farmland, deposits several feet deep, covering what had been productive soil. The smell of sulfur rose from the fissures. Witnesses believed they were seeing volcanic activity. Some thought hell itself was opening beneath Missouri. The reality was subsurface organic material being disturbed and released, but to people with no framework for understanding earthquakes in the continental interior, the apocalypse seemed entirely plausible. What makes the New Madrid sequence uniquely catastrophic isn't just the magnitude of individual shocks. It's that the Earth never stopped moving. Between December 16, 1811 and May 1812, the fault system produced over 2,000 distinct earthquakes. A Kentucky engineer named Jared Brooks operated a crude pendulum seismograph and recorded 1,874 felt tremors, shocks strong enough to be perceived by humans. The actual number, including events too small to feel, was certainly higher. At least 3 of these quakes exceeded magnitude 7.0. Dozens more would qualify as major disasters if they struck today. Survivors' journals describe weeks without a single day of stillness. The ground shook constantly, sometimes violent jolts, sometimes rolling motions, sometimes a trembling that lasted hours. Just as people would begin repairs and attempt to restore normalcy, another shock would hit. Cabins that survived the first quake collapsed in the 5th or the 15th. Chimneys rebuilt after December were shattered again in February. The psychological toll was profound. Witnesses wrote of becoming earthquake sick, a condition combining what we'd now recognize as PTSD with the physical effects of constant motion. The human vestibular system relies on the ground being stable. When that fundamental assumption is violated for months, the inner ear cannot recalibrate. People reported persistent dizziness and nausea even during quiet periods. The sensation of being on unstable ground became permanent. Animals responded with instincts humans lacked. Horses refused to be ridden or hitched. Birds abandoned nests. Dogs exhibited constant distress. The wildlife that remained behaved erratically, as though they could sense the next shock building before it struck. The liquefaction events continued throughout the sequence. Sand blows erupted across the landscape, transforming farmland into sand deposits that buried topsoil under several feet of sterile sediment. These geysers didn't just shoot water and sand, they released gases from deep underground. The sulfurous smell pervaded the region. Combined with the ground cracking open and the constant roar of seismic waves, the entire experience felt apocalyptic. There was no refuge. The shaking was too widespread, too persistent. Families that fled their homes found the ground unstable everywhere. River travel, normally the safest method of evacuation, became treacherous as the Mississippi's behavior remained unpredictable. The water level fluctuated wildly. New obstacles appeared as the riverbed deformed. Sandbars that had existed for decades vanished. New islands emerged. This was geological warfare, not a single catastrophic blow, but a sustained siege that lasted half a year. The infrastructure of the frontier, already minimal, essentially ceased to function. Communication broke down, supply lines failed. Communities were isolated, each believing they were experiencing a localized catastrophe with no way to know the entire continental interior was being shaken. And because news traveled at the speed of horseback, the outside world learned slowly. It took weeks for reliable reports to reach the East Coast. President Madison didn't receive detailed accounts until January. When the reports finally arrived, they described something unprecedented in American history. The stable heartland was tearing itself apart, and no one knew when it would stop. At approximately 3:45 a.m. on February 7, 1812, the fault released its maximum violence. The magnitude has been estimated between 7.7 and 8.1, the most powerful earthquake in recorded American history. The ground surface ruptured. Near New Madrid, the fault line violently bisected the Mississippi River at 3 separate points. The rupture wasn't a clean horizontal slide. The southern edge of the fault thrust upward by as much as 15 feet, shoving millions of tons of riverbed skyward in seconds. The Mississippi's flow didn't gradually slow. It stopped. The river had encountered an instant dam, a wall of earth where flat riverbed had existed moments before. Water doesn't flow uphill, but the current behind the obstruction didn't know that yet. The river stacked up on itself, the water column disrupted and churning. The pressure wave propagated upstream. Boats that had been moving downstream found themselves motionless, then moving backward as the accumulated water sought equilibrium. For several hours, the Mississippi River ran in reverse. Eyewitnesses on the water described the river heaping up without wind, the surface boiling and frothing as if the water itself was being shaken from below. Some boats grounded as the riverbed rose beneath their hulls. Others were swept upstream by the reversed current, crews powerless against water, moving in the wrong direction. The sound was overwhelming, not just the seismic roar, but the hydraulic violence of a massive river being forced into chaos. When the water finally stabilized and resumed its southward flow, it was moving through a fundamentally altered landscape. The riverbed had new topography. Sections that had been navigable channels were now exposed bars. Deep water had become shallows. The Mississippi's course shifted in places, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones through the deformed terrain. 18 miles south, in what is now northwestern Tennessee, the ground didn't thrust upward, it dropped. The subsidence was sudden and extensive. Forested lowlands along the Mississippi's floodplain collapsed by several feet across an area roughly 6 miles wide and 18 miles long. Water rushed in from the river, from tributaries, from the saturated ground itself. Within hours, Reelfoot Lake existed, 13,000 acres of water where there had been cypress forest and marshland the previous day. The trees didn't have time to fall. They drowned standing. Their root systems submerged, their trunks rising from the new lake like grave markers. That flooded forest still exists. Reelfoot Lake remains a permanent geographic feature created in a single morning by the Earth's sudden decision to reshape itself. The drowned cypress grove is both evidence and monument, proof that this happened, that land can become lake overnight when the crust beneath it fails. The liquefaction reached its peak during this quake. Across the Mesoseismal Zone, the area of maximum shaking, the ground split open in thousands of locations. Sand blows erupted with hydraulic force, shooting liquefied sand and groundwater as high as the treetops. The geysers didn't erupt once and subside. They pulsed with each aftershock, venting subterranean pressure through fissures that remained open for hours. The deposits they left behind, sand craters surrounded by ejected material, covered hundreds of acres of farmland, burying topsoil under sterile sand several feet deep. The smell of sulfur intensified. Witnesses interpreted this as volcanic, but the source was organic material from deep soil layers being violently disturbed and oxidized. The gas vented through the same fissures as the sand blows, adding to the impression of an underworld opening beneath Missouri. The February 7th earthquake created the iconic images of the New Madrid sequence: the backward river, the instant lake, the geysers of sand, the waterfalls where flat water had been. But it also created something less visible and more enduring. It permanently altered the drainage of the region. Stream courses changed. Wetlands appeared where dry land had been. The topography was rewritten. Maps drawn before 1812 became obsolete, and the shaking continued. The February 7th event wasn't the finale. It was the crescendo in a 6-month symphony of destruction. Aftershocks followed for weeks, some strong enough to qualify as major earthquakes in their own right. The fault wasn't finished. The stress hadn't fully released. The ground would continue moving, less violently but relentlessly, for months more. Church bells rang in Charleston, South Carolina, over 800 miles from New Madrid. In Boston, over 1,000 miles away, buildings swayed and bells tolled without human touch. Witnesses in Washington, D.C. felt tremors strong enough to rattle furniture. People reported effects in Canada to the north and New Orleans to the south. The New Madrid earthquakes were felt across approximately 1 million square miles, an area roughly 10 times larger than a comparable earthquake in California would affect. The explanation lies in what the shaking traveled through. California sits on young, hot, fractured crust. The rock beneath the San Andreas fault system is broken by countless smaller faults, composed of varied rock types with different densities and temperatures. When seismic waves travel through this material, the energy scatters and absorbs quickly. The fragmented geology acts like a pillow. It dampens the blow. A magnitude 7.0 earthquake in California might be strongly felt within 100 miles, perceptible to 200, barely noticeable beyond 300. The Midwest sits on the North American Craton, ancient, cold, dense crystalline bedrock that has been geologically stable for over 1 billion years. This isn't fractured young crust. It's essentially one massive solid piece of Precambrian rock extending across the continental interior. When seismic waves enter this material, they don't scatter, they propagate. The cold, hard bedrock transmits the energy with devastating efficiency, like a bell ringing clearly across vast distances rather than a muffled thud absorbed immediately. This is called low attenuation. The seismic waves lose energy slowly, maintaining destructive intensity across distances that would render a California earthquake imperceptible. The same magnitude event produces wildly different impact radii depending on what the waves travel through. New Madrid's waves traveled through ideal transmission medium, ancient continental shield that amplified rather than dampened the signal. The result was continental scale shaking. The February 7th earthquake wasn't just felt, it was architecturally significant across 8 states. Chimneys collapsed in Cincinnati, brick buildings cracked in St. Louis, plaster fell from ceilings in Louisville. And in cities along the East Coast, the ground moved enough to ring church bells and send people into the streets, confused by tremors coming from a direction where earthquakes weren't supposed to exist. Today, that same physics applies. The bedrock hasn't changed. A repeat of the 1811 to 1812 sequence would propagate across the same million square mile radius. But now that area contains Memphis, St. Louis, Nashville, Little Rock, Indianapolis, Louisville, and dozens of smaller cities. The population within the high-impact zone has grown from a few thousand frontier settlers to over 12 million people, and virtually none of the infrastructure was built with earthquake forces in mind. By studying ancient liquefaction features buried deep in Mississippi River Valley sediments, geologists have uncovered the pattern that transforms New Madrid from historical curiosity into active threat. The technique is called Paleoseismology. Researchers drill core samples and dig trenches to expose soil layers deposited over thousands of years. Within those layers, they find sand blows, the fossilized scars of liquefaction events. These features are datable. Organic material trapped in the sand can be radiocarbon tested. Tree rings from forests buried by subsidence provide chronological anchors. The evidence reveals a clear sequence. Major New Madrid earthquakes struck around 900 AD. Another cluster occurred around 1450 AD, then 1811 to 1812. The intervals vary, but average roughly 500 years. This isn't a one-time geological anomaly. It's a cycle. The mechanism is stress accumulation. The Reelfoot Rift remains a zone of weakness in otherwise stable continental crust. Tectonic forces, the spreading mid-Atlantic ridge pushing North America westward, the Pacific coast resisting that motion, create compression across the entire plate. That stress doesn't dissipate in the middle, it concentrates at weak points. The ancient rift collects stress for centuries until the faulted rock fails. Then the cycle resets. We are currently 213 years into the latest cycle. The fault system remains active, registering approximately 200 small earthquakes per year as stress continues building in the buried rift structure. These aren't aftershocks from 1811. They're evidence of ongoing tectonic loading, the next major rupture charging itself. 12 million people now live in the 8-state high-risk zone. Memphis, Tennessee, sits directly on the New Madrid Seismic Zone. The city's infrastructure, bridges across the Mississippi, hospitals, water treatment plants, the electrical grid, was constructed with zero consideration for seismic forces. Most buildings predate modern earthquake engineering. Unreinforced masonry structures, brick buildings without steel reinforcement, are common throughout the region's historic districts. These are the structures that collapse catastrophically in earthquakes. A repeat of the 1811 to 1812 sequence today would be a multi-state catastrophe. FEMA and the U.S. Geological Survey have modeled the scenario. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake centered near New Madrid would damage or destroy infrastructure across the entire Mississippi Valley. Interstate highways would be impassable. Bridges would fail. Pipelines carrying natural gas and petroleum products would rupture. The electrical grid would collapse across multiple states. Estimated economic impact exceeds $300 billion. Potential casualties reach tens of thousands. The cold bedrock that transmitted the 1811 shaking to church bells in Boston would do the same today. But now, the impact radius contains dense population and critical infrastructure, completely unprepared for the forces that would hit it. Unlike California, where earthquake awareness shapes building codes and emergency planning, the Midwest lacks the cultural memory that makes preparedness intuitive. The New Madrid earthquakes are history, not lived experience. That gap between geological certainty and human perception is where catastrophe incubates. The Earth doesn't forget. The Reelfoot Rift is still there, still weak, still accumulating stress from tectonic forces operating at continental scale. The same fault that reversed the Mississippi and drowned forests to create Reelfoot Lake will rupture again. The physics hasn't changed, only the number of people in the way. The New Madrid Seismic Zone remains active. Roughly 200 small earthquakes register there each year, imperceptible tremors marking stress accumulation in the ancient rift beneath America's heartland. The cold, dense bedrock that rang church bells 1,000 miles away in 1812 hasn't changed. The fault that reversed the Mississippi and created Reelfoot Lake overnight still lies beneath Memphis, St. Louis, Nashville. Cities built with no memory of what that ground can do. Geological processes operate on timescales that erase human memory, but preserve physical truth. The evidence buried in mud doesn't forget. The 500-year cycle continues whether we acknowledge it or not. The question isn't whether the fault will rupture again. It's whether 12 million people will be ready when it does.